Hello, and welcome to the Censorship Dialogues. This session is going to discuss censorship, of course, but also other issues related to surveillance and content moderation, all within the context of a human rights framework and a public interest framework. I'm joined by three panelists who are representing, for the most part, what this dialogue or what this issue looks like from the perspective of internet infrastructure companies. I'm the moderator. My name is Mallory Knodel. I'm the CTO for the Center for Democracy and Technology in Washington, D.C. And I also am glad to call all of the panelists colleagues in a variety of different ways over the years, and really excited to get them to you. But first, I want to take a moment to frame a little bit the issue. For those that are familiar with this issue, I think you'll get a different perspective on it. And for those that are unfamiliar with it, I want to also give you some perspective on what exactly we mean when we say censorship and the related issues. So, of course, the digital platforms we all know and love have changed a lot over the last couple of decades. We've gone from a view that internet intermediaries shouldn't make a lot of decisions related to the content that they tend to route or resolve or display or host on their servers. But that view is changing. And I think it's because there have been as much human rights realizations and abilities to keep people connected. There have also been many ways in which groups have become disenfranchised by the digital divide. They've experienced hate speech online, actual offline and online violence. And so there are reasons potentially to roll back some of this neutral view that internet intermediaries have been given. But what exactly does that mean? So for the most part, I think human rights advocates, because of intersections with right to privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and so on, have mostly resisted asking intermediaries to get involved because of the potential to censor or to erode rights online, or just generally to combat our rights to civic space and to organize freely. However, avoiding these conversations or keeping them from being discussed directly has led to a situation in which maybe advocates don't quite understand the inner workings of such forms of censorship, why they're done by governments, what corporate platforms have to do to comply. So there's not potentially enough nuance and debate around this issue. One way that I think that we could also make a connection with other panels and sessions that are happening as part of this larger conference on artificial intelligence is really that to achieve some of these decisions about whose speech remains online or what are the boundaries and enforcement that needs to be done at scale, there's also a necessity to bring in automated decision-making in that. So when you have large-scale botnets or abuse on platforms and things like that, it can't be sort of a one-to-one decision. So I think that we will get into some of the details later on as we listen to these various platforms talk about the ways in which they do moderate behavior online or do various forms of censorship that's required to keep the platforms running. We'll hear from them about how they do that sort of at scale and some of the techniques there. So I wanted to just also give the caveat that this is not particularly about AI, but I do think that there are ways in which there's an intersection that should connect with some of the other sessions. So without taking up more time in the framing aspect of this, I think it will be very instructive to this debate if we actually start in with the panelists. So I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, but I will tell you that we have first Tor. Tor is going to talk about its approach to platform moderation and how that's changed. This is going to be presented by Isabela from the Tor project, the executive director. We're very actually lucky to have all of these panelists as executive directors, so they know intimately from the technology and the organizational management level what this debate entails. And then also we have Quad 9. So Quad 9 is a resolver for DNS queries, and Todd is the executive director there. He's going to talk about similarly what approaches to platform content moderation Quad 9 takes. And then finally, Dmitri Vitaliev, who runs eQualitie, based out of Montreal. They make a variety of tools for censorship circumvention and also keeping activist content online in the face of DDoS protection. So Dmitri also will join us. So each panelist is going to have roughly 7 minutes or so, followed by a few questions from me as the moderator, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience towards the very end. So I'm going to hand it over now to Isabela.
Thank you, Mallory, and thank everybody for the invitation. Really happy to be here on this panel. So I'm Isabela. I am the executive director at the Todd project, and we are a nonprofit that what we do is that we build technology to advance human rights with technology that protects people's privacy, allows them to navigate the internet anonymously, and as well bypass censorship, right? So what is Tor? We are, at first, we are a decentralized network. So we have volunteers around the world who are running Tor relays as, and these relays, they are completely like out of our control as the organization. We don't necessarily control what the traffic of the relays, right? Like, so that is a huge difference between what Tor does and the VPN. A VPN, an organization, will control the servers that are providing the connection for the user. We don't. This is provided by the volunteers around the world. And a user, what happens when they use Tor, we also have a browser, the Todd browser, which is a fork of Firefox with some modification that enhance the user privacy online and security. So when the user launch that browser and put it a website to access, they are bounced around 3 relays around the world. Each relay has a different layer of encryption. So even though you are connected to a secret of 3 relays, each one of those doesn't have the full information of what is being requested and by who. And by the time you access the website, you are coming out from a completely different IP address than the original one that you're using to connect to the internet. So with that configuration, our system actually really helps people to bypass censorship, right? Like if it said it's a block in a country and they're using Tor, they can access the same content coming out from a relay that is in a different country. Another thing that we have that also helps in the case of censorship is what we call it the onion addresses, onion servers. And those are long addresses with characters and 64 characters with .onion at the end. And they only can be accessed inside of the Tor network. So if you put an address like that in a browser, accessing the normal internet is not going to work. However, inside of the Tor network, it will work. In the same way that when you are connecting to a website that you're passing through 3 relays, like I said, this service will also pass through 3 relays and will meet the user in the middle. And what that means in different contexts, it means that the security is very high because it has end-to-end encryption, but also the metadata is being obfuscated in that case. So this also really helps for the protection of the user, right? And as they are accessing the information. So I feel like our technology actually enables people to bypass censorship, enables people to access content that otherwise they would not be able to in different scenarios. Also, you can have an address like that, an onion address associated with a normal domain. Some big websites are doing this nowadays, Facebook, Twitter, BBC, DW, and they are doing it because they're being censored in different countries. Most recently, many of those that I mentioned has been censored in Russia, and this allows the users to access the site in a safe way without people knowing that they are doing that. However, there are ways for you to have this address that is not associated to a known website or even a public website with a normal domain. So in that case, you as a provider of a content is also anonymous. And that also allows people to offer content in the internet without nobody knowing who they are. And there are multiple cases where this is extremely helpful. For instance, I'm originally from Brazil. In my country, abortion is illegal. And if you even want to offer information, healthcare information for a woman related to it, you might be criminalized because it's by the law. They might see that as you are helping someone to commit a crime. So you can be punished by it. So if you are a woman health organization and you want to provide that type of content, you would like to have a way to do it where nobody knows that it's you doing it. So that type of technology is very helpful on that, right? Like on building the ability for people to share content anonymously on the internet. And there is multiple other ways that one can be using and be using the servers for human rights defenders, for instance, people who are working with human rights lawyers who are denouncing crimes, maybe crimes committed by the state, and they're giving evidence to the lawyers. They want to share that in a secret way. So they use this type of technology to share files. And I feel that it is extremely safe and safer than doing so with other end-to-end encryption tools, but that expose the metadata, right? Like, because the metadata, what it does, it says who you are, right? Your point of reference might be your phone number, might be your IP address, and who you were talking to, and what time, what date, right, that happened. And once you start analyzing that data, you can correlate with other information, and you can assume what was the conversation about, what was the context of that interaction, and can put people in danger. So obfuscating the metadata is also a very important point in the matter of being safe online when you are a human rights defender, an activist, or a journalist, or other actors on the internet. So we actually provide ways for people to be able to bypass censorship and be safe and be anonymous online. The way we build our technology, we design our technology, is that there is no centralization, there is no point of control of it. So I have no idea who are the users who are coming to my technology, who are using the network. I don't know who is downloading to our browser. I don't know if the user who I see today on the network is the same one from yesterday. There is no way for us to actually monitor that level, right? Like the user of our technology. Also, on the sites that are accessed through the technology, is also not possible for you to monitor who are the people accessing those websites. So in a way, it's very hard for us to even do anything about how the technology is being used, because by design, because we want it so, in order to protect the users, we created in a way that we cannot, nobody can know, right? Like, there is no centralization. Another thing that I feel it's important to mention is that we're not passive of censorship ourselves. We also get censored by government, by internet providers, by different type of servers. And we do have our own ways of bypassing that censorship that we have developed. So sometimes if Tor is blocked in a country and people cannot access Tor, there are ways that we call it bridges, pluggable transport, and that people can use one of those to be the first hoop of connection to the network. And those are they obfuscate the connection, or there are secret IP addresses, right? Like to enter the network that the censor will not collect, will not know about, and we can just put the censor and bypass that block. I feel that it's very important to also let people know that even though we have this care, right? Like for the user privacy, for the user information, we cannot, and we are decentralized, we cannot control anything. We have a strong policy of transparency. So anyone can download the IP addresses of the servers who are part of this network. We also have very clear, anyone can access our roadmaps, anyone can see the technical work that we are doing. Our code is open source, so anyone can read the code, can audit the code. So we have a very strong policy of transparency. We believe that in order to provide a certain level of security to our users, us as an organization, our technology that we build needs to be transparent, needs to be accessible, needs to be open to third parties reviews as well, because of we think that that is a check and balance, right? Like on the things that we're doing that can create another layer of trust. So yeah, so this is a little bit short about what Todd is, what we do. I think I can pass the mic to the next panelist.
Thanks, Isabela. I just want to highlight one thing you said that we need to come back to, which is that not only do your platforms maybe conduct to some degree moderation or looking after the behavior that's happening on your platform, but because all three of you do to some degree deploy privacy enhancing or otherwise censorship circumvention technology yourselves, you are subject and your platforms are subject to censorship. So we do see now more than ever blocking at the network level of certain kinds of protocols, banning of the use of certain kinds of tools. And so something that I just really wanted to make sure folks tracked. And Dmitri or John, when you intervene, you might touch on that as well as by way of introducing what you do. So with that, then I'm going to pass it over to John from Quad 9, who's going to talk about platform moderation in Quad 9.
Thanks. Hi. So I'm John Todd. I'm the general manager at Quad 9. Just a brief background. We're a Swiss-based organization that does DNS recursive resolution. So that means every transaction that your computer or device does that does a DNS request first to try to figure out the IP address, a recursive resolver responds back with an IP address so that your computer can do what it's going to do on the next transaction step. We provide that recursive resolution service as an over-the-top system. So replacing your ISP or replacing your enterprise resolver. We provide two different components of that which make us slightly different than the recursive resolver that you're probably already using. The first is that we offer a security component, and that we have a large number of threat intelligence providers who give us information about malicious domains, whether that's phishing, malware, botnets, spyware, etc. They give us lists of domains that they know are absolutely and exclusively doing something bad. We'll block those. So if you try to do a lookup on one of those domains, we will not answer the question, thereby preventing you from going to the site. The second thing that we do is we provide privacy. We collect no personal information about those transactions. There's no account that you need to sign up with our systems, no contract. In fact, we don't even know who our end users are, which is we treat as a feature and not a bug, although that does make reporting difficult sometimes for us when we want to do volumetrics. But so by providing that privacy feature along with the blocking, we allow end users to prevent themselves from being defrauded or infected with things. At the same time, we're not selling their personal data in any way, which is becoming more of a concern in various areas as the other numbers of things to report on are diminishing, meaning that DNS is becoming one of the last open protocols. So to that extent, we also provide encryption. So the DNS is now is emerging now as an encrypted protocol, and we're one of the first ones to do that from a standards-driven basis. I think it's also interesting to note that we provide two different flavors of our service. One has this, if you want to call it a filtered model with malware filtering, and one does not. So the end user can choose which of those they'd like to utilize. So we do give the end user the discretion to choose a filtered or unfiltered version. I think, and as Mallory talked about a little bit in the introduction here, it is the case that services like Quad 9, which are providing more or less unfettered resolution, DNS resolution, are becoming more filtered in certain areas, and there are certainly countries that will block access to the well-known set of IP addresses on which our service operates, or they'll intercept those queries and actually answer on our behalf, not with our permission. So that's an interesting component. That reasoning for that is typically either surveillance or censorship. They'll insert their own censorship in the path. So therefore, the encryption is becoming more important as a method for delivery. DNS is an interesting model to look at because DNS is really just a pointer platform. We don't actually host any content. In fact, we don't even host any of the DNS answers that we give. We're simply answering the DNS queries on behalf of our end users to servers that are operated by third parties. So this is a metadata-only service that we're offering. And in fact, the DNS is an open platform, meaning that anybody can start a DNS recursive resolver. There's plenty of software out there that lets you do it yourself to do these kinds of services internally. So it's an interesting world where there is now starting to be focus on DNS as a method to perform censorship, even though it's quite ineffective. Or at least we believe it's quite ineffective because it's possible for anyone to start up a DNS server or a recursive resolver and do this themselves. It just happens that Quad 9 has this additional component of malware filtering, and we handle a lot of the standards, whereas it's getting more difficult to run your own recursive resolver, although it's certainly possible to do that. So from a machine learning and AI perspective, there's interesting conversation there as to how that's working within the DNS. Right now, today, we are actually one of the largest consumers or endpoints that is applying machine learning and artificial intelligence to commonly used big data, and that is the DNS. We have millions of different domains that are given to us by our threat intelligence providers based on criteria that they have developed themselves that are blocking these malware events or malware domains. So right now, already, our service is using AI and machine learning in an extraordinarily extensive fashion because it's not possible for any one person or even large groups of people to look at the malware community and make some sense of it without those type of algorithms. How that then gets extended to censorship is an interesting conversation, and one for which there are no easy answers. Because again, in the future, if we look at where censorship is applied or where content filtering is applied, there are a number of different places that can be put. One is on the content hosting location. One is on the network provider that provides access to the content hosting. And the others become even more distant, such as how does the metadata discovered, meaning the domain names that the content is hosted under from a registrar or registry perspective. And then from the recursive resolver perspective, do you apply censorship rules to the recursive resolver, which is even further away. And so there are attempts at applying censorship or certainly content control at all of those layers. And it's getting, we are actually involved in not necessarily a censorship, but certainly a content management lawsuit right now in Germany, where we are currently fighting an injunction that says that because we resolve a domain name that hosts links that go to another website which hosts copyrighted content, that we are essentially extended in the copyright infringement responsibility. We object to that. We think that DNS should be essentially a transparent intermediary because we can't actually tell what's on the other end of the site. What we do, though, is that we do provide the user to select what it is they don't want to see rather than having that applied to them. So allowing the user to say, these are the things I don't want to see, rather than someone saying, these are the things I don't want users to see. I guess with that, there's a whole bunch of conversation because we operate on a metadata level, and then there's the question of where the content resides, and then there's the question of who actually controls the content. I'm really fascinated to see what the next panelists are going to bring up as how they do this, and the next questions that Mallory's going to have. So I'll cede the floor.
Thanks, John. From yours, I wanted to note too that you make a good point. I think that block lists or sort of regulations that come from the top down about what to block and how. DNS has been a very easy way to do that. In the past, a lot of governments prefer that, like the UK government, for example, but it is really ineffective, right, because of the many options that are out there. And rather, what I think you do with the security and malware filtering is provide that sort of thing as a service that's very opt-in for users who want their lookups private, but then also have this on top. And a lot of recursive providers out there that are providing similar DNS privacy lookups maybe don't have malware filtering. That's a choice. Okay, on to Dmitri, our last panelist, to talk about eQualitie and its various tools and features and how you think about this issue of moderation. Go ahead, Dmitri.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dmitri Vitaliev, talking to you from Montreal. And it's a pleasure to be here and on this panel as well. So we come to this panel from both ends of the censorship debate. Our decade of experience delivering digital security solutions for the protection and promotion of human rights online shows that it is possible to have your censorship cake and eat some of it too. But we think this cake needs a better and maybe a more commonly adopted recipe. In one such recipe here at eQualitie, we select our clients and in effect, they become content moderators for the websites protected by the Deflect project. It offers free services to civil society groups and media around the world. For comparison, we're like a small, open source and principled version of Cloudflare. We started Deflect at around about the same time. Now, mitigation on our network is also performed by machine learning. But I guess what's important here is that we do not allow the machine to make the final decision on who to block, who to censor on our networks. Since our client's DNS resolves to us, we are on the receiving end of all the complaints coming in to our clients and regarding the content on the websites. Now, being a responsible provider, we have to turn into moderators of our own communities. We field complaints from various far-right groups and their lawyers, all sorts of aggrieved Latin American businessmen, South Asian bureaucrats, various state censorship bureaus. Sometimes we field complaints from local businesses here in Canada too. This is how we approach moderation. The complaints process is always handled manually by humans. All complaints are received and seen. We involve the clients in cases which are not clear to us. We include our staff who are ultimately responsible for running the service and should have a say in the way how it is run. And as well, our board in the sort of last level of resort or decision making. Now, in the 10 years we've been running the Deflect service, we've answered hundreds of different complaints, yet less than a dozen of these have ever led to our requests for content takedowns from our clients. And all of them were agreed to by clients, by the rationale that we had presented. And this really hasn't taken up too much of our time, especially considering that our clients do receive quite a lot of complaints, have quite a few enemies. Now, we believe that this ever can scale to larger platforms as long as the team that handles these requests scales with client growth. We did some numbers before, and we are able to apply our moderation techniques to a clientele of 1 million websites with a team of 10 full-time staff. I think it shows to us that it is possible to be a principled and responsible service provider when it comes to the topic of content moderation. Now, just briefly on the other side of the censorship cake, we also create technology that helps people circumvent network restrictions And thereafter, they can share this content with other users, peer-to-peer. We have no control of how this content propagates through this distributed network. We don't know much about our users or their activities by design. In a way, it is a project that is similar to Tor, although technically it operates a little bit differently. Now we have a dilemma here. Equality, the staff at eQualitie, we're not necessarily free speech absolutists. We decry and forbid the usage of our technology for promoting content that goes against our organizational values. Yet, we're not able to do much about it yet. So, aside from the technical challenges of perpetuating illegal content on a decentralized network, we also find it morally complicated to block content on a project which is called Censorship.no. So we're still looking for the right recipe for this cake. We have a few ideas, but no beaten path to follow. So I'm hoping to explore this in a little bit more detail in the rest of the panel with you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much to all three of you. I wonder if we can now have the whole panel together in view, because I have questions, follow-up questions for each of you, but then we're going to open it up to audience questions after that. So my first question is to John. I wanted you, especially because you are operating right now in Switzerland, and as far as I know, that was a conscious choice. If you could talk to us about the question of jurisdiction in your content moderation practices, or I shouldn't be saying content, it's not always content, but in your sort of user behavior, system abuse moderation practices,
Sure.
How do you handle those?
Sure. So our location in Switzerland is actually it's not specifically focused on jurisdiction of how we answer our queries. That's the reason for Switzerland was because there are harsher penalties if we don't do what we say we're going to do. Swiss law really holds us to our privacy guarantees on our that we say we're going to. So that was a conscious choice in slightly a different way of jurisdiction. But the question about jurisdiction is actually the core one that we're struggling with, in that it's very difficult to determine what is the legal jurisdiction in which a user resides or to which a law applies when you're looking at DNS queries. Really, we have an extremely small amount of data to work with, and this again sort of comes back to the ML and AI version of how do you teach a system. We have the IP address of the query, and we have the query itself, which is usually just what's the domain that people are looking for. And it's very difficult or impossible for us to come up with a true jurisdiction of where that query came from. So even if there are laws that apply in a particular jurisdiction, how do you make certain that you're applying them correctly? We have some cities, as an example, which receive traffic from dozens or hundreds of countries. What law set applies on servers that receive that? So the question of jurisdiction from in something like the DNS, which is really, it's just a pointer exchange, it's a metadata layer, it's very, very difficult one to determine. So we've had to rely on some really crude methods. Okay, where does the actual server exist? So, all right, so maybe some laws apply there. Okay, where do we think users are coming from? It's a terribly crude model. And when we're talking about pointers, it starts to become really difficult or impossible to determine how do jurisdictions apply, because there's so little information on which to derive a decision as the service provider. We think that this ultimately is a bad place for censorship to be configured, because it leads to uncertainty. If I can't be certain, or my organization can't be certain of where a user ends up, we're going to probably have to err on the side of broader application of censorship, and each country, each jurisdiction has their own sets of rules. This is going to lead to we think, some really bad spillover, overblocking, or erring on the side of not transmitting information, which we think is the wrong direction in which to go. So it's a difficult question. I don't have a clear answer, but I know that the way we're doing it now is probably not the best one. So that's my thoughts on jurisdiction. There's a lot more I can go into on that, but it's not a clear answer right now.
That soundbite was almost perfect. It's like, we know what we're doing is not good enough. We don't know what to do differently. It's kind of a tagline for any kind of online moderation. Isa, I want to turn to you because I know that you have some opinions about how other platforms are dealing with moderation. And I think we'd really benefit from hearing what those are, as well as I wonder if I could throw a bit of a nuance in there. What do you think that maybe Content Layer or other platforms are doing could be informed by or be improved by what sort of the lower layer is doing on these same things?
Thank you, Mallory. Well, I think I will start with sharing an example, because we don't like know who are users or what they're doing. We do have some type of moderation regarding the volunteers who run the servers that build the Tor network, right? Because what we do is that we watch the servers that shows up, because we want to avoid having malicious or bad, what we call bad relays, right? Like malicious relays that are entering the network just to attack our users or de-anonymize our users, right? So it's interesting because even though we do that, there is no one point that decides and takes the action, and we don't use necessary AI or machine learning in the process either. What we do, we have a system where we have a different stage, right? Like we try to publicize and make it clear for any volunteer what are the criteria, and we are trying to get better on that, right? Like we're trying to get better on governance of the community and communication with the community on that front is one of the things that we're investing a lot this year. While we try to publicize what are the criteria that we accept of a good behavior and what would be considered bad behavior and get your server excluded from the network. We have a team that is watching for those criteria, and they are watching for other types of things that they can see if the relay is misconfigured or if the relay is acting in a malicious way. Once they decide on a relay, okay, this relay should not be on the network, they don't have any power to do that. What they do is that we have what we call it the director authorities. And the direct authorities are trusted volunteers. They're not necessarily controlled by Tor, the nonprofit whatsoever. And what they do is that they run the direct authority servers that from time to time, they take a picture, let's say, right, like of the network, which is like they see they share all the list of relays of IP addresses that they see with each other, and then they come to a consensus of what it is the network at this time, right? If you imagine this is a volunteer-run network, so it changes, right? And we need to know what are the servers out there to provide to our users the ability to connect to them. So these volunteers, trusted volunteers, are the ones who does that, running the direct authority. So our team, what they do is that once they detect a malicious relay, they send to them as suggestions to be removed from the network. And those they need to have a consensus between those direct authorities to exclude those servers from the network, and then they are kicked out. So I feel like what is important that I'm describing here in comparison with what the industry is doing, all of that, right? It's check and balance, right? Like it's not just one single entity who controls the decision-making process. And also, I know that in large scale, you do need some machine learning, right? Like to help with the detections of whatever you are moderating. But I feel also, and to the point that Dmitri made it earlier, right? Like whoever is hosting the content does have a content policy, does have some values that they want to be respected. They are not necessarily free speech absolutists, right? Like, and they will want to moderate content that they believe should not exist in their platform. So I feel like having that very clear for everybody so they can check like what you're doing goes with your policy or not is another point, right? Like the same way our criteria are publicized and people can check what our criteria are. I feel that a process where you have a body like who is not the machine, right? Like a human group of people making those decisions is also important. I work in the industry. I know that it's very passive of mistaking the whole AI and machine learning, especially when people who are building these tools and these mechanisms, they're always doing this with English as a first language. So once you start to apply that to other language, things get messy. And I know that for sure because I work very close to this type of natural language analysis in my prior work. And I know sometimes the whole process, it's very messy and they're not training the algorithm in the language and so forth. So it's important to have the human check. And more important is to have a third party, right? Like evaluating. And I feel that's where things get messy most of the time because the organizations, like the big platforms who are doing content moderations, most of the time they don't make data available in a way for researchers, for other groups in the entities to do the proper evaluation of are they actually moderating according to the values that they have publicized that they will do it, right? Like I feel like all those elements are important to be put in place when you are working with content moderation. And because it's a lot of power, depending on the user base you have a lot of power when you are controlling the content that people access or not. So I think it's extremely important that transparency and third-party auditing being part of that process is extremely important.
Great, thank you. Dmitri, my question for you is around how you have come to think about these challenges running your peer-to-peer tools. And I know that is a real effort in helping the internet to not be so centralized, right? Because that feels in many ways like a weak point or a single point of failure, or other things can go wrong also in the context of capital-driven platforms. I wonder though what you think then are the promises, but maybe also some of the challenges of more decentralized approaches to this in ways that can sort of support and strengthen internet platforms in a new way beyond what we've already seen.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'll stick to one of the projects that we run, the Sino browser, which is the browser for the Censorship No project. Basically, this is a web browser you download on your phone. It is also based on the Firefox browser. And thereafter, you simply type in the websites that you want to access. Now, beneath all of this is what is called a peer-to-peer network. It is a network made up of other users of this browser, sharing content and routing messages for each other. However, we have decided to use this peer-to-peer network as an intermediary between the users and the centralized internet, the normal World Wide Web. Because at the end of the day, we believe that that is where most of the content that people around the world want to access lives. And there are different decentralized peer-to-peer networks which are sort of enclosed to the content, only introduced by its own users. It's sort of a walled garden of content. And there's a lot more kind of opportunity there for various technical and maybe moderation decisions. But we have decided to connect this peer-to-peer network with the World Wide Web and with users on the other side. So there must be something in between this network of peers and the World Wide Web. Now, this is infrastructure that is run by us, by eQualitie. These are the server injectors. or the network injectors. So messages, or more specifically websites requested by the users, if they are not found inside the peer-to-peer network, go to these injectors, and a request for that web page is made from these injectors. So here we have a decision, should these injectors serve all of the web's content? In principle, yes. It's a project called Censorship Dialogue, and its purpose is to help people get around network censorship. On the other side, there's a lot of, different, vile, illegal, whatever type of information that we may not want to inject into this network. How do we come to this decision? How do we become a content selector, content censor on the Censorship Dialogue network? Then, after we do inject this content, we kind of lose control of it. So the first person that requests this web page accesses it, and thereafter they share this web page with other peers using the decentralized network. Now here we have no way of knowing really how many times they've shared this content. How far has this content propagated? Whilst on the normal centralized web, there is semblance, maybe not semblance, there is a form of accountability for the content that you're putting online. On a peer-to-peer network, that accountability actually evaporates. Now, we can make decisions about how long this content can live on this network, how long it perpetuates, and set this time frame to being sort of very restrictive, very short, or very long. Now, if we are to consider that the internet is full of, good and bad information, we should possibly look towards a more shorter time span so that we do not propagate content we do not agree with forever. Now, other decisions we need to make is how much to know about our users and how they use the tool. Now, in fact, again, this is much easier with a centralized tool since everybody comes to your server before they can do anything. And very difficult, nay impossible, with a decentralized tool, where the whole point is that there is no central server or service provider. So then do we build in, tracking content moderation tools into our software? And a few secure messages, for example, are going in this direction. They may, let's say, absolve human decision from it by letting algorithms and machine learning perform content selection and moderation and censorship. But we do not do this yet, particularly for the fact that we're not dealing with messages or content which is readable, but we're dealing with any web page out there, which is a very complicated task that includes both text and image and video, audio content. Then I'm happy to put a pause there.
Okay. I think that we can also return to it, right? There could be other things that maybe we ask each other questions. I know there are a couple of questions from the audience right now. I want to read one. Well, actually, I'm not going to read it verbatim because I think I can reinterpret it. There was a question about the role of the developer. And I want to expand that to ask you all your views on the role of your entities in making the right decision. How do you know, or do not, your values of your companies and your individual staff come through in these decisions? And how does that then affect whether or not you're able to abide by human rights guidelines and those values themselves? I'll let you interpret that how you want. Anybody can start.
I'll pick this one off. And I think I won't say I'm speaking for the other members of the team here, but I'm also going to say that it tends to be a pattern that people working for privacy-focused companies tend to be pretty far over on the privacy-focused side of things. In other words, it's a mission. It's more of a life decision than it is a profession. I know here at Quad9, the entire staff is working here because we truly, deeply believe in the privacy mission that we have, and also the security mission. So I suppose the answer to your question, one of your parts of your questions, is that we are typically way over on the privacy side of things, and so we often need to scale back and say, all right, well, we understand what we're wanting to do for the end user. What are the legal and practical constraints that we have to address, and how can we square those with the overriding goal of providing that privacy and anonymity and service to the end user? And those are challenges, right? We do what the law tells us we have to do. That's really where it comes down to, which is why I was so interested in this jurisdictional question previously, because what is reasonable and required in one country that we may be familiar with is not what's reasonable and required in another country in which we also may be providing service. So there are those, how do we square our own beliefs against the norms in other places where we offer service, yet we still have to remain within the law. And so we're actually creating an ethics and privacy board that will sort of answer some of these questions and build guidelines for us as an organization. So it's not just an amalgam of personal opinions. We're looking to figure out how can we sort of outsource this to some third parties to give us some guidelines to which questions of censorship, questions about how do we apply things like machine learning, and what are the algorithms doing so that they can be applied in a fair way that treats everyone equitably. Those are the kind of questions we're going to be outsourcing to that organization or that body that we're creating. So that's the short answer is we all love privacy. We're all very much strongly in favor of it, but we have to square that against the legal requirements. And so we need an intermediate body to sort of answer those questions for us and create guidelines.
Either Lisa or Dmitri, do you want to answer on that one?
Okay, I'll add just quickly. I agree with what John says, that a lot of people are driven by the values of the organization. I believe it is very important that those values are upfront and center when these developers or tech support or whoever comes, to the organization. However, we have also found that it is useful to separate personal beliefs and politics from day-to-day work, particularly when it comes to the questions of content moderation. It is useful to have different opinions coming from different staff, yet it is the kind of the company ethos, the values that have been defined, maybe even before they joined, that must prevail in the end. I think there is always a slight conflict between, being personally motivated by the mission of the company and having personal beliefs, obviously, on various topics. And when these beliefs begin to clash with the values of the organization, and in some instances they do, they cannot always be in parallel. So developers play a big role, but I think they play also a very important role when their personal positions and viewpoints are not necessarily what defines the software product that they work on.
I can jump in really quick to share what Tor. We at Tor, we actually have a social contract. So we publish that social contract where we are listing, right, like what we will, our contract with society, right, like what we will do, what we will, and most of the things I mentioned here as part of our values, it's in that social contract, right? Like our tools are for advancing human rights. They should be free of access. They should be free to use, to adapt, and distribute. So there is we want to educate people, make sure that they know about the tools and the technology. But we have one point on a social contract that we will never intentionally harm our users, and that it's placed there very importantly because we want to make sure that the user can trust us, that we will never, for instance, if there are pressure to put a backdoor or anything that changed the technology that could be exploited as a vulnerability to harm our users, we will not do it. And I think putting this on the social contract make a huge difference in big relationship to the trust. And also when we have someone coming in, right, like working for Tor or a volunteer, they are also abiding with not only the social contract, but they also with a code of conduct, which is something also internal for our community or organization. But they abided by that, right? Like, and we have other different ways in either internally within the nonprofit, right, like the official organization, but also within the community, we have different methods of governance to, right, like if there's a report of someone disrespecting that it can be escalated and that way. But I feel like making those public and that social contract is one of the strongest tools we have to show people what we stand for as an organization and what we are promising, right, that we will abide by, right?
Great. So this question came in through the stream and is directed at Isa about Tor's funding. But actually, I feel like it's an applicable question for everyone, right? How do we ensure the sustainability of tools that are not explicitly charging users?
Well, we're non-profit, so donation. that's one of the ways, right? Like anyone can donate to Tor, and we actually really appreciate all the support. But we also have grants. We have grants with private foundations. We have grants with the government. We also have a membership program where the private sector can support Tor in monetary, right, as well. And we have different organizations who have similar values to Tor who became members and are supporters of Tor. So that's pretty much the way a nonprofit survives, is donations.
Yeah, I'll second that. I mean, we take donations from end users. Please go to our website and donate. But we also take funds in other ways. We have aggregate information, which is useful for data for our threat intelligence partners, as an example. So we kind of have a worldwide view of what the threat landscape looks like in a volumetric basis. And so that's interesting in ways that we can feed back to our threat intelligence providers, as an example. But also grants and direct sponsorships are certainly the way that we continue forward. As a nonprofit, there are also some costs that we avoid as well. Because we don't have a customer base that we're charging, there's a lot of overhead that we can avoid, and we can operate with a much smaller team than we could, as an example, if we had to manage a very large accounting staff and a customer database and all of the other accessories that go along with a for-profit organization. If you're really focused just on delivery of service, it's surprising how much you can get done or how effective you can be with every euro or dollar of money that you get in the door. So someone doing things for free often has some advantages that a for-profit company does not. Lastly, we have a huge number of sponsors in kind. Almost all of our infrastructure, as an example, has been donated to us by third parties. And with a for-profit company, that would be an operational expense ongoing or even a capital expense ongoing. And we've avoided some of those costs as well. So yes, if you're getting the service from free, you should be very aware of who's paying for the product, but we make that fairly transparent. So it's all in how much you investigate the nonprofit that you're using.
It's also kind of great to think about these as being slim services as well, or agile. Is another way of thinking about it.
Yeah,
So
we're
not.
not. Yeah.
All right, just quickly. Yeah, majority of eQualite's revenue has come from public funds, taxpayers' money in Canada, in the USA, in the European Union. And I think this is how technology which is developed for social good should be funded now and in the future as well. We do have efforts at commercialization and thereby sustaining ourselves in the future, and also, other forms of private donations too.
I wish there was more interest in funding these projects from a a larger social good perspective. Our experience has not been quite the same. While we're providing a public good, it's been very difficult for us to get government-sponsored funding, realistically, certainly directly. We would love to see that. We think that there is a public good that we're doing, but I think that still, from the short-term horizon, we're looking at institutional funding, meaning grants and other ways of developing revenue. It's difficult to explain what we do sometimes to governments. So that's our perspective, at least.
I hope that this panel has helped. I genuinely hope that folks understand a little bit more some of these low-lying infrastructures that are actually really critical to internet freedom, for lack of a better term, but really are keeping people connected, keeping them safe and private, but maybe aren't as visible as some of the big platforms that do, have a lot of, take up a lot of space in our collective imaginary about how the internet works. But thanks so much for sharing your expertise, for talking about it a bit more. I hope that folks feel free to find your respective organizations online and reach out if they have questions or would like to follow what you do. Thanks, everyone.